Replacing the chain on your mountain bike is something that's actually very easy to do yourselves at home, but getting it the correct length and joining it correctly can be a little bit confusing. So let's get to the bottom of that, shall we? Now, before we get started, let's just take into account the different factors that mean having different length chains on bikes. Okay, so the amount of gears you have will directly correlate to the amount of chain required. A bike with 9 gears will generally have a shorter chain than a bike with 12 gears. A bike with triple chain rings on the front end will require more chain to be able to get around the bigger outer chain ring than a bike with a single chain ring. Although that said, on modern mountain bikes like this one with a single chain ring on the front and 12 gears on the rear, you have a huge spread of gears. In fact, the biggest sprocket on the rear of this one is 52 teeth. It's absolutely massive, so accordingly that needs a lot of chain, and they all differ slightly. And the next thing to take into account is the rear suspension design, if you have one, on your particular bike. Now, most mountain bikes have some form of chain growth. Now, you get the odd bike that has 0 chain growth, but most suspension bikes will have an element of it as the axle moves through its suspension path. With chain growth, of course, you need to enable for basically a slightly longer chain to counter this. Now, depending on your suspension design, the amount of growth you have will completely vary. No one bike is the same, but typically a bike with a lower pivot might have less chain growth, and a bike with a higher pivot would typically have more because the axle moves typically backwards slightly more, so the chainstay effectively grows. So of course the chain is going to stretch in that process. If you don't have enough chain, this derailleur can actually be forced to stretch so much you can damage that derailleur, and it can also limit the amount of gears that you can get. Now, a quick way of just seeing how much chain growth your bike has would be to put it in the biggest sprocket at the back. So that's the lowest gear. That's if you've got a single chainring on the front. If you've got 2 or 3 chainrings on the front, put it in the biggest chainring as well. Now, put your bike on the ground. If you can get someone to do it for you, get them to compress the rear suspension, maybe on a saddle with their elbow, and watch that lower cage. So what you'll notice is it will move backwards and forwards a small amount. If you've got lots of chain growth, it will move quite a big amount. If you've not got much, it won't move at all. It just gives you a bit of an idea there. Now, when you buy chains, they tend to come in 2 lengths. Of course, there are some anomalies on the market. Tend to be 112 and 126 link options available to you. Now, unless your bike has especially long chainstays on it, or if your bike has exceptionally large gearing on there, most people will get away with the 112 link option. But if you're unsure about this, the best way to do it literally is count your links. Get to it. Now, one last thing before we start calculating the chain length on this bike here to take into account is the make of your transmission. Now, of course, there are various options. There's box components, there's micro, there's loads of options out there, but the big boys tend to be SRAM or Shimano, and they both have differing ways of measuring their chain. So depending on what group set you have, it is worth checking with the manufacturer before you get going with this process. Shimano, for example, when they calculate their chain length, they say that you do not need to take suspension sag into account. You just make the measurement. Whereas SRAM is the total opposite. They want you to make their measurement with your suspension compressed. So in order to do that, you either need to remove the shock from the bike and move your bike through the travel, or deflate your shock, or if it's a coil shock, remove the coil spring. So we're going to show you the SRAM method for ease here, but basically the ease of joining the chain and the way you do it is the same basically on both methods. Now, the method for calculating your chain length does differ between brands, so it is worth checking with the manufacturer of your transmission, be that box components or maybe SRAM like I have on this bike, or Shimano. Now, Shimano give you the measurement. You don't need to do anything to your suspension. They offer you 2 different options with a hardtail bike or a suspension bike. Whereas with SRAM, they want you to cycle your suspension through its movement by deflating the shock or removing the shock from the bike to make sure the chainstays are at maximum length before calculating how long you make the chain. Okay, so the first method I'm going to show you is how to measure for Shimano chains. Now, of course, this is a SRAM chain and a SRAM transmission. I'm purely demonstrating to you how you would measure your chain length on a Shimano bike. So you do not need to interfere with your suspension. You just do it as the bike is. Now, what you want to be doing is wrap that chain around your biggest sprocket if you have multiple ones at the front, and your biggest sprocket at the rear. Now, do not go through the derailleur. Leave the derailleur hanging. So obviously this is a SRAM one, so I've got the cage lock on to get it out of the way here. It just makes it a bit easier, but for Shimano ones, just ignore that. So biggest and biggest, and you want to be making the measurement at the back of the cassette. Now, if you look closely here, this is where it counts, because you want to be measuring each link at the pivot point. So you measure each link at the nearest pivot to the cassette here. Okay, so for 12 speed, which is what I'm doing here, you're looking at 4 to 5 links plus the joining link, which is known as a quick link on Shimano systems. Now for 10 or 11, you're looking at 2 links. On full suspension bikes, 10, 11 speed, again, it's 2 links. And it's an additional link on full suspension on the Shimano chain. So you're looking at 5 to 6 links. So I'm just going to demonstrate to you how you make that measurement. So you get your unsplit chain here at this point. So this is hopefully a brand new chain. You wrap it around your chain ring, taking care to get it onto the chain ring correctly. I've actually got a chain guide here. I've taken off the outer plate just to give myself easier access. And then wrap it around the cassette at the back here. Like so. A little bit fiddly, but that's just the nature of it. Now, this point here, where you get the 90-degree bend in the chain, this is your 0 point, so you do not count this one. You count your measurement from this one onwards. So the first pivot, that counts as a link. So 1 link, 2 link, 3 link, 4 link, 5 length, and up to 6, as you can see. So that would be your 6th length. That's where you would split the chain. Obviously it's on a male and female one here, so you would actually take the chain off at that point and your quick link goes on the end. And that would be the correct length if it was the Shimano method. Okay, now for the SRAM method of calculating your chain length. Now ignore this first step if you have a hardtail. But if you have a full suspension bike, you're going to need to deflate your rear shock or remove it from the bike. Deflating is more accurate because you want to be cycling the rear suspension through the travel, so effectively your chain stake is at the longest position it can be at. You want to hold your rear wheel in position with it deflated. Old toe straps are the best for this. They're reusable, super handy things to have anyway, and they're non-damaging because they're basically fabric. So before you deflate your air pressure, if you want to make it faster to set your shock up afterwards, just note down the pressure you have in there. That is if your bike's set up right. That way you can just put the same pressure back in when we've done. Okay, so with the shock deflated, I already noted the pressure was 210 in my case, and a toe strap holding the rear wheel in position here. We now know that the chainstay effectively really is going to be about its longest position. So that's the correct way that SRAM recommends you measuring it. Now, next step is to do the same sort of concept as the Shimano. So around your biggest chainring, or the single chainring if you have one, around your biggest sprocket at the rear and bypassing the derailleur. But this time, instead of making a measurement at the rear of the sprocket, you're measuring it on the overlap. Now the overlap is different between hardtail and full suspension bikes. For obvious reasons, on a suspension bike it moves. Now on a full suspension bike you're looking for 1 inner and 1 outer plate. On a hardtail you're looking for 2. Now if you have an oval chainring, it's still just the 1 or the 2 depending on if you have hardtail or full sus, but you must measure it with the crank in the 1 o'clock position. This takes into account where the oval chainring is at its biggest and accordingly gives you basically the correct chain length. Okay, so with your chain length identified for your bike, whether it's a Shimano SRAM or hardtail or full sus, you can then proceed to shortening your chain to the correct length, making sure you take into account leaving enough room for that joining link. For this, you're definitely going to need a chain splitter or a chain tool. The purpose of this is to drive the pin straight out of the chain. It's a very simple process. I'm just going to demonstrate this now. This is an old Shimano chain, by the way, not the one I'm going to be using on the bike here. But this is one for the purpose of, I can split this as many times as I need to just to show you in how to do it right. So the idea is you would lay the chain in the chain guide of the tool at the correct position here. Now note, when you're splitting any chain, you need to split it at the correct point. So this is where your master link is going to join in. So make sure you split at the same equivalent point so it looks the same at both ends. Line up the driver and that pushes the pin out the other side. Hold the chain very firmly, make sure it's all lined up, and it will definitely give, just like so. And you can proceed to push that chain through. Now it's a good idea to not go all the way through, and you can keep that link as a spare should you ever need it again. and then you remove it from the tool, and with a bit of wiggling, you split your chain successfully. Very simple, but just to emphasize, make sure your chain has the relevant link on both ends to enable you to use that joining link. Now, a bit about joining links. There are various different ones on the market. They all do the same job, but they all have different names. Shimano use Quick Link, SRAM use Power Link, and Power Lock. Now, the most important thing you need to know about these type of joining pins is the majority of them are single use only. So once you've joined your chain with it, it's a permanent fix. If you ever need to split your chain and you split it at this point, which is the obvious point when you break a chain, don't reuse these, okay? So the Power Lock is single use only. They're found on 10, 11 and 12 speed SRAM chains. The Power Link is found on chains with less speeds, and you can reuse those. Okay, so make sure you note that. The Shimano Quick Link cannot be reused. KMC have a joining link as well, that also cannot be reused. Like I said, the majority of them can't, but if you're unsure, check with the manual. Now, I have used these before to rejoin a chain in an emergency case, but you cannot put any proper power down and it will fail at some point. So this is emergency only, just to get your chain on so you can very softly pedal your way out of trouble, get back to wherever it is you need to get a fresh link. But just take that into account. Single use only, dangerous, they will break. Now, in the case of modern Shimano chains, you use the Quick Link system. But older chains up to 11 speed, it wasn't too long back, you needed to use these dedicated joining pins. Now it's a break pin basically, so you push the pin through and you break out the excess at this point here. It's a really simple system to use, but if you're joining up to an 11 speed Shimano chain without a Quick Link, you must use one of these. And the reason is when you push the pins out of a chain, basically the chain has been very slightly stretched from that pin being in there. If you drive it back in, it's not going to be a good fit and the links will come apart. Now if you look up close on this, the end has got a slight dimple in it. You'll see it's very slightly bigger than the rest of it. That's because it's pushed in, it's designed to fit that hole to close it up and basically be a permanent fixture. So make sure if you need to use anything up to 11 speed and it's not Quick Link compatible, that you do get the relevant joining pin. Now, unless you have someone to help you, holding a chain can be quite tricky when obviously you've got to hold it on both sides and operate the chain tool. So do yourself a favour and get yourself a third hand tool. Now you can buy specific versions, or if you have a bit of metal or an old spoke lying around, you can make 2 or 3 from a spoke. Literally bend a slight angle, bit more acute than 90 degrees, and that will hold your chain for you, leaving the loop there, ready for you to have your one hand to join the chain and the other to join it with the tool or whatever method you're actually going to be using. It's a really simple little tool to use and it will definitely make your life easier. Now, when it comes to actually joining the chain and using your little third hand tool, you want to route your chain basically, or route your chain around the chain ring or chain rings. Make it easy for yourself. If you have a triple or a double, put it on the smaller chain ring. If you've got a single, obviously just around a single. At the rear, you want to put it on the smallest sprocket, so that's the least amount of tension on the system. And again, make sure you route it correctly through the sprockets at the rear here until it's hanging down at the bottom. Nice and simple. Then we're going to put the third hand tool in place just to make sure that it holds it nicely. And then I'm going to show you how to join the chain using your joining link. In this case, it's a Power Lock. Now you'll notice with the profile on this particular one, so this is for SRAM Eagle, the 12 speed, is flat on the top. So you actually want the flat piece to be on the underneath here. So when it's at the top of the chain, it's flat. Look at the profile shape of it. The flat bit does not want to be running around your gears. You want the curved bit to run around the gears. So therefore, that is the correct orientation. So it follows the chain around into place. So this is why those third hand tools are very helpful. Now it's very important at this stage, no matter what brand you're using, to make sure it's located firmly in place on both sides. You literally push it into place, and before you release the third hand tool, make sure the pin, you can see it's actually located on both sides. Now you notice there's a bit of a slot or a channel here. Now what I want you to do, once you've located the place in place, remove your third hand tool, and this will go slightly more taut. Then I want you to cycle the chain backwards until that joining link is at the top of the chainstay. Now think about this, you need this to pop into place as the whole way it works. And once it's in place, it's a permanent join. The easiest way to do that is by using the natural tension on your chain, which is at the top. If I just move the crank there, you can see it's naturally pulling on the chain. You can use this assistance to snap that link in place. But before you do it, I emphasize the point again, make sure it's in place on both sides, because if you go and join it and it's not in place on both sides, it will pop it into place on one side and the other side will peel open. And sometimes it can damage the link and you won't be able to use it again. Trip to the bike shop, buy another link, start again. So get it right the first time and it won't be a problem. Now with your joining link, or in this case the power lock at the top, carefully unlock your rear derailleur. So it pulls in all of that tension. And then, I mean, the position I'm in is ideal. I've got my left shoulder with the tyre here so I can keep it in place. And I want to cycle that chain and you'll see that it pops that into place. And then obviously you want to be checking that it's definitely in place on both sides. That's pretty much it. It's as simple as that. But the most important thing to remember is to double check and triple check that that power link, quick link, whatever brand it is, has locked into place completely on both sides. If it doesn't look right, then it's probably not right. Okay, so check that before you ride it. In my case, I've got to just put the outside part of the chain guide back on. I've got to reinflate my shock to 210 pounds. That's the pressure I noted down. Obviously remove that toe strap off there, and then it's good to go and hit the trails. Now, I'm sure there might be some of you wondering why I didn't just count the links on the chain that was already on the bike. Well, sometimes you might break a chain and you might lose it. So you still need to be able to calculate the correct length for your bike. And other times, if you're lucky enough, you might be converting to one buy, or you perhaps might even have a brand new bike that's in components that you're laying out. So in which case you will need to use one of these methods to calculate your chain length. Hopefully this video has cleared it up if it was confusing for you. As I like to think of it as just a little guide, basically. So hopefully it's useful. Let us know what else you'd like us to make in those comments, and we'll see you again soon. Ta-ra.